Two from Galilee. A love story by Marjorie Holmes.
We're near the end of Chapter 11 in our series of readings from Two from Galilee. This is an edited version of the book published by Fleming A. Travell Company, written by Marjorie Holmes. Last time we heard of Mary's father Joachim coming to visit her while she was staying at her aunt's house, at Aunt Elizabeth's house. Joachim was quite shocked by the fact that Elizabeth was pregnant. He was totally unaware of that fact, especially at Elizabeth's age. And he was almost afraid to look at Mary to see whether the miracle was really true. We find out today what Joachim is not telling Mary, and a little bit more about Joseph's reaction to the whole situation as we continue in Two from Galilee. Enough. Joachim was ashamed. He wrenched his thoughts back to the present. How could he get away before the evening meal? The strain of watching his manners would be too much after this. And he couldn't bear the look in Mary's eyes, their silent pleading. She'd be asking about Joseph. And what could he tell her? That there had been no more dealings between the two households? That he'd scarcely seen him? And that gradually the fear had taken root in him that Joseph might be preparing to divorce her? No, he must get out of there. If he remained, she might wring it from him. He had never been any match for her. But he was forced to stay, and there was no help for it. Not when Zachariah appeared, and Elizabeth explained why he couldn't voice his welcome. Evidently, the thought of reproducing himself at his age had proved too much for the old fellow. He'd been struck dumb. An irreverent, vaguely horrified amusement shook Joachim. He could hardly blame him. He was dumbfounded himself by these happenings. Thus, he too could only sit pretty well speechless throughout the long meal and the prayers and the washings to which he was unaccustomed, suffering, praying mostly for escape. He made haste to leave. Then it happened as he feared. Mary accosted him on the steps, but she seemed so small and lost and far from home, and her little white face was so eager as she lifted it to his, her eyes so large with hope, that he couldn't do it. He was forced to lie. "Joseph is fine," he assured her heartily. "He couldn't make the journey. At least I didn't see him among those who came up from Nazareth, but he sends you greetings." Then, without telling her the truth, he made off, fiercely, down the hill. Chapter 12. To work, to keep building, that was the main thing. For when we cease building, hope dies. And so each evening Joseph plunged doggedly up the path to his unfinished house. How had it ever seemed beautiful to him, he wondered, gazing at the dull stone walls? They were dead now, no longer suffused with light. They were as a tomb. And the roof. It was essential to get the roof on. So long as these poor walls stood roofless, he had a queer feeling of exposure. It seemed to him that once the house were firmly roofed, then Nazareth's mouth would be shut as well. For there had been talk, much talk. At first a half-merry astonishment that his betrothed, who should be firmly in his charge these months before their marriage, had taken herself off. That they had been hard enough to bear, the jest, the thoughtless teasing, but he'd managed to grin and return them in kind. Yet as the buds of spring gave way to green, burning summer, a new tone came into the questioning, as if scandal-hungry tongues were already beginning to lick their chops. "Where's Mary? When's she coming back?" "Oh, any day now," he'd say cheerfully over the coals of his throat. "Soon." He'd not gone up for the Feast of the First Fruits. He'd looked forward to it wildly, to see her again, to discover that all she'd told him was true. Since she was recovered in mind and body, maybe it was a dream, he thought. But his father Jacob had fallen ill. He had been given more and more to the hidden wineskins, and when they were empty and he was too bloated and breathless to get more, he begged Joseph in secret to obtain them for him. Timnah had been beside herself. "You must stay with us, Joseph. You're the only one who can handle your father." So then he thought of sending a message to Mary. But there was no money for papyrus or parchment, which could be rolled up to keep his words private, and he was ashamed to set them down on broken pieces of pottery that the poor used. His thoughts were too precious, his torment of longings and the way it was between him and her family, how Hannah scorned to speak to him in the synagogue, and Joachim's look was one of dark reproach. No, there was not room for all this on fragments of clay, nor could he have brought himself to write it. This was private, and until he could be with her again, he would have to endure it alone. Then the spear out of darkness, the shock of unprovoked assault, plunging. He thought of her words, "I am with child." Perspiration on his face, "I am with child." It kept ringing with ears. Then his mother's remark one evening that Joachim had been home for several days bothered him. "Your brothers tell me they saw Joachim in the fields." Joseph gasped. "Why didn't someone tell me?" "Well, your brothers probably wanted to spare you embarrassment." "And Mary? Do my brothers who are so anxious to spare me, are they also whispering behind my back that they've seen her too?" "Now, son, I'm sure that if Mary were home, she'd have been seen at the well. I'm sure all Nazareth would know." "Haven't the tongues of Nazareth anything better to wag about than the comings and goings of a young girl?" "Why are you so offended? There's always such interest in things," his mother said. "It's only natural. Mary's been gone over 2 months now. It's natural for people to wonder." Joseph's brow darkened. She turned, and he saw that his mother's composure was breaking. The placid face was struggling against tears. Her mouth worked. She who was usually so gallant became pitiably grotesque. "Haven't I enough to worry about with your father? This sickness of his, this shameful sickness that causes him to stumble and fall in the street, isn't it enough? That he can't drink wine openly with other people, but only secretly, to become besotted, so that he's a joke and a spectacle to the public and a grief to his family. And ill, so ill from it, too." She broke off, shaking with soundless sobs. "Must I endure all this and that, all these things, this shame and disgrace to my son as well?" Helpless, Joseph regarded her, her tears scalding his soul. Abruptly she went to the pitcher and poured a gourd of water to calm herself. She took a towel and wiped her eyes. When she faced him once more where he sat at the table, her eyes, though red, were stern. "You don't sleep nights," she said. "We hear you prowling around to all hours. You're working yourself into the grave. And for what? For a maid who may or may not return." "Mother, I beg you, don't say such things." "It's been a long absence," his mother said. "If there is any reason for her to be absent from her home and her betrothed husband, then let it be known, and let it be known as well what you're going to do about it." Joseph stood frozen. "Mother, what are you suggesting?" "Only that you face up to your own sense of honor and the honor of your father's house. Jacob deserves that much of you. That much at least. A man who's been misused in a marriage contract can set that woman aside. You know that. I know it seems harsh, but sometimes there's no other way when a man has just cause." "I have no such cause," Joseph said. Then, because he'd shouted, and his mother seemed so shattered, he embraced her with a blind, desperate tenderness. "Please don't worry," he said gently. "I'm sorry if I failed you or caused you further grief when you're already so burdened. But God will surely send Mary back to me in order that our marriage contract may be fulfilled." Joseph ran outside to the home he was building. It had begun to rain. There was a bench in a protected corner of the house. The rain was coming through the roof. In an access of weariness, he lay listening to the cold, beating fists of the rain, which finally trailed off until there was but a rhythmic dripping from the beams and the scolding of birds that had been disturbed by the trees. He lay staring into the darkness of his house and gradually facing the bare truth of his position. 3 courses were open to him. The first, unthinkable, public denunciation with its possibility of public infamy and even capital punishment. The second, to assert his rights as her espoused, demand that she be brought back to consummate the marriage by living with him and assume the legal paternity of her child. But that he dared not linger over. The third, to go quietly to the authorities and divorce her without scandal. The elders were just men. They knew and respected everyone involved. Perhaps they would not insist that he specify adultery as his grounds. They would accept what was only too evident, desertion. He fought off the despair that threatened once more to overwhelm him. He turned over on the narrow bench, pulling the cover to his eyes that his mother had left there. Suddenly he could not bear it. To be here with this decision in the house so nearly completed, the place that was to have been their own, yet he could not face the people he was likely to meet on the streets, and he could not bring himself to go home. He lay there like a wounded thing, enduring his suffering. All night long he lay awake with it, or so it seemed, trudging the same bitter paths and always arriving at the same terrible conclusion. But now and then he dropped off, for now and then he dreamed. Figures scurried along the paths with him, arguing among themselves and pushing him this way and that. Sometimes he stumbled as he had that first night of Mary's announcement, but always he would rise up, bruised and bloody, and plunge on. "Put her away. Give her up. Yes, you've reached that end. Go to sleep now." "But I am asleep. I'm dead, and I'm in a coffin. I'm in a cold rock cave." He clawed about for the ragged shawl that had fallen to the floor. A chill breeze blew through the open door, as though a great moon seemed to have risen, a moon whose light was so intense that he must shield his eyes. He half roused, blinking, his blood racing, for it seemed to him he was not alone. "Who is it?" he demanded. "Who are you, and what do you want?" His own voice startled him. He realized he must be talking in his troubled sleep, and yet his fear did not abate. He was ashamed of it, and yet he couldn't help it. It was like a familiar nightmare, where there was great danger or great ecstasy forthcoming, and he was powerless either to rise and flee or to lie in quiet expectation. Then he heard the voice from the half-sensed presence at his feet. "It's all right, Joseph. Fear not. Be calm." And as he waited, still only half awake, the voice came again. "I am a messenger, sent from God. I am sent to tell you that you must not fear to take Mary your wife, for that which is conceived in her is indeed of the Holy Spirit, as she has said." Joseph opened his mouth, but he could not speak. His elbows bit into the hard bench where he lay, half sitting, yet powerless to rise. The light was as a blinding flame. "She will bear a son," the voice continued, "and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins." "Don't mock me," Joseph said. "Whoever you are, whether from God or not, don't torment me further." "But it is true, Joseph, even as she has told you. Remember the prophecy. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and his name shall be called Emmanuel. That prophecy is to be fulfilled, Joseph, son of David. So delay no longer in taking her as your wife." What happened after that, Joseph was never quite sure. He only knew that suddenly it was dawn, gray and misty in the shell of his house. The cock was crowing, rough hands were shaking him. He found himself blinking into the face of his brother Samuel. The usually merry mouth was grim now, taut with disapproval and concern. "I told our mother I'd probably find you here. She was upset when she got up to attend to Father and found you hadn't come home. I'm sorry, I lay down to rest, and I fell asleep. Is that all you think about, is this thing between you and Mary? And as for our father, he's dying. Are you too selfish and blind to see it? You owe it to him to take the step that'll let him die in peace." Dying? Joseph had been so taken aback by his relationship with Mary, thinking about what might happen, that he hadn't noticed. He hadn't noticed that his father was dying. So the angel has now appeared to Joseph in a dream, and Joseph has to decide what he's going to do with Mary. As we continue near the end of chapter 12 in Marjorie Holmes' book, 2 from Galilee.